This often overlooked archipelago, commonly thought to be long forgotten to Europeans since the Romans, marked the beginning of Castilian maritime expansion. However, the archipelago was inhabited by the native Guanche people. Despite common thought, the islands were well known to European cartographers at the time, appearing in period maps, with the island of Lanzarote being the first to appear, in the Portulano of Dulcert of 1339. In fact, Genoese, Catalan, and Majorcan traders frequented the islands. Lanzarote Island itself was named by the Genoese explorer Lancelotto Malocello, who landed on the island. Their penetration was to the extent that some maps, such as the Cresques 1375 map, painted on the archipelago a white banner with a red cross, a known symbol of the Genoese. In Richard Henry Major's introduction for the Canarian, he even states that Luis de la Cerda was granted the Fortunate Islands, as the Canaries were once called, as a fief by Pope Clement VI in 1344, with the title of Prince of Fortune. He then writes that the King of Portugal sent a letter to the Pope stating that he had sent expeditions to the Canary Islands, but was prevented from sending a conquering force by war with Castile and the Saracens, as the book calls them, but did submit to the Pope's desires. As for what became of the Prince of Fortune, Luis de la Cerda, Major writes, "Meanwhile, the Prince of Fortune made but little progress towards the acquirement of the royal domain with which the Pope had endowed him. In short, the whole project proved a mere abortion, and neither the treasury of the Pope, the property of Don Luis, nor the knowledge of the geography of the Canaries were advanced one iota thereby." But to learn about this kingdom in the Canaries, you must first learn of its lord and founder. Jean de Bethencourt was born in Normandy, within the Kingdom of France, in 1362. His father would die in the Battle of Cocherel 2 years later, and the family-held lands of Grainville had its castle demolished in 1365. The King of France ordered the demolition of the castle during the disturbances caused by King Charles of Navarre in Normandy. He ordered the destruction of all castles belonging to traders, or those castles whose owners could not commit to defend, so that the enemy couldn't use them. Grainville was not considered defensible, as Jean de Bethencourt's father died and he was a minor in charge of it. In 1377, at the age of 15, he would serve under the Duke of Anjou, first as a baker, in charge of the pantry, but would eventually rise to the position of squire over the years. At the age of 25, on April 11, 1387, Jean de Bethencourt got permission to rebuild the castle at Grainville. In 1390, the Genoese petitioned France to fight Muslim pirates who roamed the Mediterranean. There was a lull in the fighting between France and England, so they organized a crusade under the command of Louis II of Bourbon. They brought 1,500 knights, and Jean de Bethencourt joined in this crusade. 80 ships embarked from Genoa, and arrived at the city of Mahdia, then under the rule of the Hafsid dynasty, and laid siege to it for 2 months. The Crusaders were unorganized, but were at least able to free many enslaved Christians. They soon realized, though, that winter was approaching and that Mahdia was disposed to hold out for many more months. The Crusaders would all return to their countries via Genoa and Savoy. One reason that the Mahdia Crusade is important in relation to the conquest of the Canary Islands is that because it was the Genoese who rediscovered the Canary Islands and their ships went there often, Serra and Cioranescu write that Jean de Bethencourt, because of his time at Genoa and inspired by his own participation in the crusade, it would not be unreasonable to think that his idea to conquer the Canary Islands originated from this period. Gadifer de la Salle, an adventurer and French knight, was born in 1355 and served the king's army since 1372. Gadifer intended to join the Barbary Crusade as Bethencourt did in 1390, and was at Genoa, but eventually turned back to France after hearing that the Seneschal of Bigorre died to then replace him. According to Herbez, he and Bethencourt were both important members of the French court. Before the expedition, they likely knew of each other for years, as they both served under the Duke of Anjou and were relatives of the Duke of Orleans. Bethencourt described his planned expedition to Gadifer de la Salle, who, according to the contemporary priest historians of the Canarian, wanting to make his own fortune, was overjoyed in hearing Bethencourt's offer to join him. Gadifer was rejoiced to hear of the proposed expedition, and many courteous words passed between the two which it would be tedious here to repeat. Serra and Cioranescu write that strangely for the era, there was no written agreement between the two over the voyage. Bethencourt likely made it seem that they would go as equals. Later on, Gadifer would allude to the promises that Bethencourt made, but without alluding to any piece of writing. This would be the source of much misery for Gadifer. In addition to the aforementioned priest historians, Brother Pierre Bontier and Jean Le Verrier accompanied Bethencourt to chronicle his journey in the book The Canarian. Jean de Bethencourt, alongside Gadifer de la Salle, set sail from La Rochelle to the Canaries with 2 ships and 280 men on May 1st, 1402. But poor weather made them stop in La Coruña, Galicia. It was at La Rochelle when a nobleman from Caux in Normandy named Berthin de Betrayal joined Bethencourt and his party. They also stopped in Cadiz until July and finally sailed to the archipelago. It took them 8 days to reach the island of Graciosa in the Canaries. However, they struggled with desertions, and by the time they arrived at Lanzarote, the 280 men they brought had whittled down to just 63 men. Now, unlike the previous European voyages to the archipelago, which would only land to take the Guanche to sell them off as slaves, Jean de Bethencourt came as a colonizer, with the intent to make money off orchil, a lucrative dye. Upon arriving on Lanzarote, the island's ruler King Guadarfia paid homage as a friend to Bethencourt and his men, and let them build a fortress on the island, which was called Rubicon. So the Normans and the Lanzarote natives would coexist for a time. Jean de Bethencourt and Gadifer de la Salle departed for Fuerteventura and entrusted Berthin de Betrayal in charge of Lanzarote. According to the Canarian, Berthin de Betrayal disliked Gadifer over his higher position. A rivalry between the Norman and Gascon crew began. Someone even threw a dart at Gadifer, and plots and schemes would be made. It was this dissent, alongside their plotting, that the priests say whittled down the 280-man party to just 63 men. After the quick occupation of Lanzarote, Gadifer de la Salle and Bethencourt went to conquer Fuerteventura by night. A company of men led by Gadifer tried to find the natives, but the natives withdrew early upon seeing the arrival of their ships. After 8 days of searching and starting to need provisions, they returned to the island of Lobos. Gadifer and the knights would discuss and planned for their ship to go to the Rio de las Palmas at the mouth of the river and to fortify themselves there until the island was conquered and the natives made Catholic. An ambitious plan, but it would not be so. The commander of the ship, Robin Brument, denied entry to both Gadifer and his men. After some negotiation by his brother Colin Brument, they let him enter under the condition that they came in weaker than they were as a hostage. Because of the low provisions, the mariners had low morale and were mutinous. Realizing that the mutinous mariners were anxious to leave for Cadiz, the nobles and Gadifer got Bethencourt to return to Spain with the mutineers in order to sell the boat and return with fresh men and supplies the colony needed by Christmas of 1402. They talked with the mariners, and after 6 weeks in Lanzarote, headed for Cadiz. Once in Cadiz, Bethencourt sued the mutineers, and some of them got arrested, and he seized control of the ship. Despite getting an offer for 1,500 doubloons, Bethencourt did not sell the ship and sailed for Seville. It was at this time, when Bethencourt was away, that Berthin abandoned Gadifer de la Salle in the island of Lobos while he was hunting seals. Berthin de Betrayal rebelled, pillaging and taking over Rubicon. When 2 Christian Lanzarote natives told Berthin that the Spanish were preying on them, he said that he would protect them, but he lied, as he even took the native king of Lanzarote prisoner to sell him and others after getting them drunk after a meal. The Lanzarote king was able to escape from captivity. The priests who wrote this chronicle describe Berthin turning over his 22 native prisoners very vividly. There now remained only 22 prisoners, whom Berthin handed over to the Spaniards of the ship the Hamar, after the example of the traitor Judas Iscariot, who betrayed our Savior Jesus Christ and delivered him into the hands of the Jews to crucify him and put him to death. So did Berthin, who delivered up these poor innocent people into the hands of robbers who sold them into perpetual slavery in foreign lands. Berthin would escape, as Gadifer and his companions would return too late to Lanzarote on a boat. 12 men, later realizing that Berthin was a traitor and feeling guilty, confessed to Jean Le Verrier, and out of desperation and fear over the response of Gadifer and Bethencourt, took a boat to Morocco. Of these 12 men, 10 drowned, and the other 2 were made slaves. Once the Tahamar landed in Castile, Gadifer's trumpeter, named Cortil, had Berthin and his accomplices arrested and imprisoned in Cadiz. He also notified Bethencourt, who was in Seville, of what occurred. All the now non-existent natives of the Canaries today are called Guanches, but each island's native had their own name and culture. Those of Lanzarote were called the Majo, and after the mutiny of Berthin de Betrayal, they lost confidence in the colonists' ability to protect them and rebelled, with many colonists being killed or wounded. One Majo native named Afche, uncle of a native interpreter to the Normans, met with Gadifer de la Salle and said it was King Guardarfia behind the killings. Afche proposed that Gadifer help him depose the king, and in exchange he would make the population convert to Christianity. But he was lying, as he intended to usurp Guardarfia, but also kill Gadifer. Gadifer, with 20 of his men and with the help of Afche, captured King Guardarfia on November 24th, 1204. After this, Afche dressed as king and betrayed Gadifer, unsuccessfully attacking some colonists. Gadifer, as a last resort, planned to kill all the quote-unquote men of defense on the island and to convert all the women and children to Christianity. King Guardarfia escaped from the Rubicon prison and had the pretender Afche stoned and burned, returning the Lanzarote Majo to his rule. On this situation, one manuscript of the Canarian writes, "And we struggled when we could to take people, because this is our only consolation in this moment, so that if any ship from Spain or elsewhere arrives, we could exchange slaves for provisions, seeing that Bethencourt has totally abandoned us, because he did not help us as he had said and promised. By his fault we live poorly and are in great misery if God does not help us. And all this we have because of the treachery of Berthin de Betrayal and his companions and the delay and great negligence of Bethencourt." The conquerors were running low on food, for they only had at most 3 months' supply, which were gone by Christmas 1403. The chronicle laments that they had not had wine nor bread in a long time. They feared that they would be forced to eat meat on Lent. They captured and imprisoned the Lanzarote king Guardarfia on January 25th, 1404, and with him found a month of food for all of them. On the eve of Lent, King Guardarfia asked that he and his household would be baptized. He was baptized the following first day of Lent. Jean de Bethencourt was away for all this turmoil, at Castile to meet with King Henry III and pay homage to him. The King of Castile was pleased, and according to the Canarian, the king said, "It shows a very good intention on his part to come to do me homage, for a country which, as I understand, is at 200 leagues distance, and of which I never heard before." He was given 20,000 maravedis in funding by the king. This quote is incorrect, if not fictitious, as during the beginning of King Henry's reign, in 1393, an expedition was sent to Lanzarote from Seville. Jean de Bethencourt was now a vassal to the King of Castile as Lord of the Canary Islands. While Jean de Bethencourt was away, Gadifer explored much of the archipelago, as he had been to Fuerteventura, the Grand Canary, Ferro, Gomera, and Palma, and returned to Rubicon after a voyage of 3 months. Jean de Bethencourt would return to Rubicon from Spain on April 19, 1404. With him he brought wheat and other small necessities like mattresses, blankets, and wine. Gadifer talked to Jean de Bethencourt over what he felt he deserved for his service, and asked for the islands of La Gomera, Fuerteventura, and Tenerife, all yet unconquered. Jean de Bethencourt did not do this, but they did temporarily set aside their differences for an expedition to Fuerteventura. Bethencourt would visit Fuerteventura and stay there for 3 months, capturing natives and sending them back to Lanzarote, and building a fortress there known as Richeroque. He strengthened his rule over the islands as he understood that the King of Fez now claimed the Canary Islands and was preparing to attack them. After this, the relationship between Bethencourt and Gadifer de la Salle would sour, with them exchanging angry letters and having hatred for each other. Encyclopedia Britannica sums up Gadifer's plight quite succinctly as Bethencourt's long absence and self-promoting actions. One of Gadifer's main problems was that Bethencourt made himself sole lord of all the Canary Islands. This bitter animosity would last for 15 days, until Bethencourt made a small party, which Gadifer de la Salle joined, for a failed expedition to Gran Canaria on June 25, 1404. After this trip, they returned to Fuerteventura. Gadifer de la Salle would make his own fortress, called Balterhes, near Puerto de los Jardines, a league from Bethencourt's fortress of Richeroque. Unfortunately for Gadifer de la Salle, who had to deal with much trouble in the Canaries, Bethencourt didn't consider his interests while in the Castilian court, as he wasn't awarded with the rule of Fuerteventura as he expected, and according to Major, this dispute led to Bethencourt and Gadifer both traveling to the Castilian court in separate ships to argue their cases, but Gadifer would eventually give up on his cause and return to France, never again to set foot on the archipelago. After this, Jean de Bethencourt finished the conquest of Fuerteventura, as its conquest, which started in 1402, was delayed by the turmoil of mutiny and rebellion, and ended with the 2 Guanche kings of Fuerteventura converting to Christianity in 1405. According to the Canarian, they surrendered as they realized they could not hold out while only being armed with stones and wooden lances, and upon hearing of how considerately the Christians treated those who became subjects to them willingly. The first king, along with 41 companions, was baptized as Luis on January 18, 1405. The second king was baptized as Alfonso alongside 46 of his companions on January 25, 1405. Both were baptized in the presence of Jean de Bethencourt. It's worth noting that Jean de Bethencourt did try to conquer Gran Canaria in October of 1405, but this expedition ended in ironic failure. In the Canarian, the priest chroniclers write of this expedition, stating, "When they arrived, they were somewhat proud of having advanced so far on the mainland of the Saracens, then boasted a Norman named Guillaume d'Aberbos, that with 20 men at most, he could easily cross the entire island of Great Canary in spite of all the Canarians, although they were stated to be full 10,000 fighting men, and contrary to the wish of Monsieur de Bethencourt, they commenced their skirmish, and landed at a village called Argunigui, in 2 boats containing 45 men, amongst whom were some of Gadifer's people, and drove the Canarians well back into the country, but were themselves very disorderly. When the Canarians observed this want of order amongst them, they rallied, and fell upon them and defeated them. They gained possession of one of the boats, and slew 22 men. Among these men were many of Gadifer's people, and even the illegitimate son of Gadifer de la Salle. This passage hints that perhaps Gadifer's involvement in the Canaries was not yet totally complete. They also tried to conquer La Palma after retiring from Gran Canaria, but this, too, they had to quit, after 6 weeks of fighting, losing 5 men, but claiming to kill over 100 natives, and so they endeavored towards El Hierro. The next island to be conquered was El Hierro in 1405, then called Ferro by the conquerors. According to the Canarian, formerly it had been extensively inhabited, but the natives had been captured at different periods and been made slaves of in foreign countries, so that few now remained. After, 111 native Guanche in El Hierro, alongside their king, were sold into slavery by the conquerors. Jean de Bethencourt would settle El Hierro with 120 households, and the priests write that if he had not done this, it would have been entirely unpopulated. This is not true though, as native toponymy persists, indicating cohabitation with the colonists. It is very important to note that the Canarian, while a contemporary source and a useful one, is biased. We have 2 manuscripts of the Canarian in the modern day, and there are substantial differences between the two, thanks to their authors, Gadifer de la Salle and Jean V de Bethencourt, only adding to the Canarian's unreliability. Parts of it are even fictitious. More on that in a later video. One example of such a bias is how when Berthin de Betrayal sold 22 allied Guanche he kidnapped into slavery, he was compared by the priest authors of the Canarian to Judas Iscariot himself. However, when 111 Guanche from El Hierro, in addition to their king, met with Bethencourt, where in an act of treachery they were partitioned as loot and some sold off as slaves, Bethencourt himself kept 32 for himself, including the king of El Hierro, and the Canarian justifies this decision by writing, "This Monsieur did for 2 reasons, to appease his companions, and also to provide dwellings for those whom he had brought from Normandy, by way of not causing displeasure to the inhabitants of Lanzarote and Fuerteventura." A very odd shift in tone on the matter of slavery. Reliability is only more of an issue as Serra and Cioranescu write that island sources make no mention of this episode, and they add that either this vile act was so shameful that it would be impossible to hide, or that it was a confused addition later added by Jean V de Bethencourt. I personally believe that this act did not occur, and agree with what they said about Jean V de Bethencourt. 2 days before his last departure from the Canaries, Jean de Bethencourt held a feast in Rubicon where he would determine the levies and dues owed to him. Jean de Bethencourt also instructed the people to be good Christians. In this feast, he would appoint Maciot de Bethencourt, his nephew that he brought back from one of his previous supply runs to Europe, as his representative and governor. He even gave Maciot 1/3 of the revenue of the country for as long as he lived. The priests write that Jean de Bethencourt made Maciot de Bethencourt his representative and governor because he was of the same lineage that he was. They also write that the people were pleased with Maciot being left in charge of the government. Jean de Bethencourt, lord of the Canary Islands, last departed the archipelago in 1411 or 1412. Jean de Bethencourt, after conquering all the islands he could with his limited means, went to Valladolid and on June 26, 1412, paid homage to Castile as he was already considered a Castilian vassal. That same day, he obtained permission from Castile to mint his own coins on the island, but this privilege was never acted upon, improbable under his economic circumstances, as there have been no coins found with his effigy or symbols. This portion is according to the introduction to the Canarian by Richard Henry Major. In 1412, the quote-unquote tyranny of Maciot's rule of the Canaries led to Queen Catherine of Castile to send 3 caravels under the command of Pedro Barba de Campos. Maciot de Bethencourt, despite the fact Jean de Bethencourt was still alive, sold the islands to Pedro Barba de Campos. Then Maciot went to Madeira, and in an act of fraud, sold the islands again, but this time to Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal. Maciot again sold the islands, but this time to the Count of Niebla. Pedro Barbas de Campos, sold his ownership of the islands to Fernando Perez of Seville, which the Count of Niebla also bought. Guillem de las Casas obtained the islands from the Count of Niebla, and then Guillem de las Casas gave them to his son-in-law Fernand Peraz, just to make the island's ownership even more confusing. What Richard Henry Major wrote, though, was incorrect and outdated. Now, on October 17, 1418, John de Bethencourt from Granville signed an authentic power of attorney for Maciot de Bethencourt to pawn, sell off, or do whatever he saw fit with the islands. Then, on November 15, 1418, Maciot donated the 7 Canary Islands, those conquered and yet unconquered, to Enrique de Guzman, Count of Niebla. This is corroborated by the document 111 provided in the appendix of Volume 1 of the Canarian by Serra and Cioranescu. Meanwhile, one of the authors of the Canarian, Jean Leverrier, was appointed in Rome by Pope Benedict XIII as a coadjutor to Bishop Fray Mendo in 1419. He then became the bishop in 1421. I was surprised to learn that he got assassinated later while in Portugal. The Hundreds-Year War between England and France once again escalated, and Bethencourt's home in Normandy was on the front lines, as the English took Harfleur in 1415 and defeated the French in the famous Battle of Agincourt. On January 8, 1418, he got double letters of safe conduct from the King of England, proof that he still had economic ties with the Canary Islands. Things only deteriorated for the French in Normandy. In the spring of 1418, Lower Normandy was already in English hands. The fortress of Sainte-Catherine fell on August 30th, 1418, and the town of Caudebec fell on September 9th. The English only waited for the fall of Rouen to occupy the Caux region, and Upper Normandy already could not resist. This caused much panic, and many nobles would flee or submit to the English. Since Castile was an enemy to the English, Bethencourt's vassalage was incompatible and would have to pick over the Canaries or his lands in Normandy. Jean de Bethencourt paid homage to the King of England, becoming a vassal, as Normandy passed into English hands on May 16, 1419. As for Maciot giving away the islands, Serra and Cioranescu speculate that perhaps Jean de Bethencourt saw this as a temporary renunciation of his claims, with the hopes to retake his claims. And they reason it would have been done because of circumstance to avoid the confiscation of the Canaries. This act of vassalage saved his 2 remaining fiefs of Bethencourt City and Granville, since he abandoned his claims to the Canaries. The Canarian writes that in his retirement, Jean de Bethencourt would receive news from the islands, and according to the Canarian even intended to return, but died before being able to. Some sources say that Jean de Bethencourt died in 1425, 1422, or even 1418. This 1422 date is completely rejected by Serra and Cioranescu. He most likely died between August 17, 1425 and January 24, 1426 in Granville. A lot of English sources describe the Canaries as a kingdom and label Jean de Bethencourt a king. Even the Canarian calls him the king in the later part. However, these parts of the Canarian are fictitious, and earlier portions, more based on reality, do not call him a king. For example, when Jean de Bethencourt went to Seville and paid homage to the King of Castile prior to returning to the Canaries in 1404, they write, "The king then spoke encouragingly to de Bethencourt and told him that he was pleased with his proposition and accepted his homage, and insofar it was possible, gave him the lordship of those Canary Islands." But Spanish sources specifically don't call him a king, or the islands a kingdom. One example of his true title is from a period document from when Jean de Bethencourt paid homage to the king and queen of Castile in Valladolid in 1412, and is called Señor de las Canarias, meaning Lord of the Canaries. As such, I would not describe Jean de Bethencourt as a king, nor his domain a kingdom, but that he was the lord of the Canary Islands. It's interesting since this video I originally set out with the goal of learning about the Kingdom of the Canary Islands as a state. So imagine my shock upon hearing, it's not even a kingdom. The lordship of the Canary Islands only conquered the smaller and least populated of the Canary Islands. Gran Canaria and Tenerife, for example, were very populated, and the expedition to conquer Gran Canaria in 1405 ended in failure. At the time, they did not even attempt to conquer Tenerife, which was nicknamed by them as the Island of Hell. The priest chroniclers write that the country is very good for all kinds of agriculture and numerously inhabited by the hardiest race to be found in all these islands. They have never been run down or carried into servitude like those of the other islands. The history of these islands is fascinating, as are the exploits of Jean de Bethencourt and Gadifer de Salle, although I can't say he prospered much from this. It almost goes without saying that the long process of colonization they started was not beneficial for the native Guanche. The more I learned of Gadifer's role, I see how much he did for Bethencourt and his domain, and yet profited so little from it. However, just as engrossing was the endeavor by historians to separate the historical facts from contemporary biases and future agendas. They do me and all future generations a noble deed with their efforts. Today, the legacy of Bethencourt and his exploits have not been forgotten, as many place names remain, such as this Maciot de Bethencourt Plaza, and the town of Bethencurian, located where poor Gadifer de Salle made his fort of Baltarhes. The surname of Jean de Bethencourt, now with many spelling variations, persists in the Canary Islands, even spreading to the New World as Canarians would emigrate to Spanish colonies. The surnames of other Norman colonists also persist in the Canary Islands. The kingdom began with the conquest of Jean de Bethencourt, then the regency of Maciot de Bethencourt, and ended with the Señorío de las Islas de Canaria under the possession of Enrique Guzmán, Conde de Niebla.